HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Great Air Race, Death, Glory, and the Dawn of American Aviation by John Lancaster. Read by Jonathan Todd Ross. Prologue. The snow came on suddenly, as it often does in the Wyoming high country, all but blinding the two aviators in their wood and fabric biplane. Hunched in the open front cockpit, Lieutenant Edward V. Wales reduced power and descended to within a few hundred feet of the ground, where the visibility was slightly better. But there was little room to spare beneath the clouds. Soon after the aircraft leveled off, the terrain started to rise. Wales advanced the throttle and began a slow climb. Before leaving Rawlins some 20 minutes earlier, Wales and the man who rode in the cockpit behind him, Lieutenant William Goldsborough, had decided to fly the direct compass line to the temporary airfield at Fort D.A. Russell in Cheyenne, on the far side of the Medicine Bow Mountains. They briefly had considered a safer route along the Union Pacific Railroad tracks, which ran north of the highest peaks before veering south toward Laramie and Cheyenne. But the detour would have cost them valuable time, another 40 minutes or so at least, and the two were in a hurry. Now, Wales was having second thoughts. The blizzard showed no sign of abating, and he knew that the tallest mountains were still ahead. Better to follow the railroad after all. He banked the DH-4 into a left turn, then flattened the wings on a new compass heading to the north. Neither man was particularly worried. They could still see the ground and were making good progress. It wouldn't be long before they picked up the railroad, and with it, an unobstructed path across the prairie to Cheyenne, where fuel and food awaited. They could make up the lost time on the next couple of legs. With a tailwind and a bit of luck, they might even reach Omaha by sunset. In the meantime, Wales was careful to maintain an even distance between the biplane and the moderate uphill slope. At more than 8,000 feet above sea level, the air was bitingly cold, but the aviators were used to it by now. An isolated ranch house passed beneath their wings. Glimpsing a group of cattlemen in the snow, Goldsborough stuck an arm out of the cockpit and gave them a friendly wave. The cowboys would have heard the thunder of the big V-12, and if they were close enough would have recognized the tricolor roundels of the U.S. Army Air Service. It was early in the afternoon of October 9th, 1919. A little more than 24 hours earlier, the two flyers had departed San Francisco on the first leg of a grand adventure, a coast-to-coast airplane race, the likes of which the world had never seen. As conceived by William Billy Mitchell, the brash, sharp-elbowed brigadier general and war hero who would one day be celebrated as the father of the U.S. Air Force, the reliability and endurance test, as the race was officially known, would be unprecedented not only in length and duration, but also in number of participants. More than 60 airplanes divided into two groups, one on Long Island, the other in San Francisco, would take off for the opposite coast some 2,700 miles distant, crossing in the middle and competing for the fastest flying and elapsed times. It was a bold and risky undertaking. Though the race was open only to qualified military aviators, none of the men who signed up had attempted a journey of such improbable length, and for good reason. Like all aircraft of the day, the surplus warplanes they would fly were almost comically ill-suited for long-distance travel, or arguably for any travel at all. Open cockpits offered scant protection against wind and cold. Engine noise was quite literally deafening. Engines were unreliable and sometimes caught fire in flight. Crude flight instruments were of marginal value to pilots trying to keep their bearings in clouds and fog. But that was only part of the challenge. The route across the country was almost entirely lacking in permanent airfields or any form of aviation infrastructure. There was no radar, air traffic control system, or radio network. Weather forecasts were rudimentary and often wrong. In the absence of electronic beacons or formal aviation charts, pilots followed railroad tracks or compass headings that wandered drunkenly with every turn. Every hour or two, they hoped, they would land at one of 20 control stops between the coasts. Most were makeshift grass or dirt airfields that had been hastily demarcated and stocked with fuel, spare parts, and other supplies, sometimes just hours before the start of the race. Despite these slapdash preparations, Mitchell and his colleagues in the Air Service decided at the last minute to double the length of the race. Instead of a one-way flight between the coasts, it would be a round-trip journey of 5,400 miles. It was as if, in the absence of anything resembling a national air transportation system, Mitchell had decided simply to will one into being. His motives were nakedly political. Though it had given birth to the airplane, the United States had been a latecomer to World War I, and had fallen behind Europe in aviation, as clashing armies competed for dominance of the air over the Western Front. Now, as the United States rushed to demobilize, Mitchell feared that its long-term security was at risk. The country needed a robust aviation industry to fulfill both military and commercial needs. Part of the solution, he believed, was a cabinet-level Department of Aeronautics to include an independent Air Force, as called for by several bills pending in Congress. He also sought to protect the Air Service from the worst of post-war budget cuts. A gifted showman, Mitchell conceived the race as a stunt to demonstrate the transformative potential of aviation and rally the public behind his goals in Washington. To that end, he had a powerful ally in Otto Prager, the driven, sometimes ruthless Texan who ran the fledgling U.S. airmail service and embraced the contest as a prelude to a transcontinental airmail route. In one sense, at least, Mitchell's timing was good. Despite the victory in Europe 11 months earlier, the country was fearful, anxious, and in need of a little distraction. The influenza pandemic, which ultimately would kill about 675,000 Americans, only recently had begun to recede. Many cities were in turmoil, as nativist mobs fueled by racism and anti-communist paranoia visited their fury on immigrants, unions, and especially African Americans, several hundred of whom were lynched during the so-called Red Summer of 1919. And Washington was rife with rumor and speculation over the health of President Woodrow B. Wilson, who recently had suffered a stroke. Against that backdrop, the contest came as a welcome respite, an irresistible pageant of grit, daring, and skill that would play out over many days and thousands of miles. The press certainly covered it that way. In reporters telling the world's greatest air race, or sometimes simply the Air Derby, was a sporting event as compelling as the World Series, which was still underway as the race began. Daily box scores ranked pilots by their flying times on each leg. Photos of grinning airmen next to their machines appeared in newspapers across the country. The New York Times ran more than 30 stories on the contest, 8 of them on the front page. As news of the competition spread, crowds at some control stops along the route grew so large that police were called in to keep them from interfering with takeoffs and landings. Library shelves were stripped of books on aeronautics. The country's fascination with the race owed as much to the contestants as it did to the novelty of the airplane. Reporters made much of the rivalries between these mythic, seemingly fearless birdmen. Among them were an ordained Baptist minister, whose German police dog shared the rear cockpit with his mechanic, a swaggering, cigar-smoking former track star who flew with crutches in the cockpit and metal braces on the legs he had shattered in a crash in France, and several bona fide combat aces, one of them a general's son who had twice managed to escape from German imprisonment after he was shot down behind enemy lines. For the duration of the race, and sometimes beyond, these and other contestants would attain a celebrity to rival that of sports heroes and silent film stars. None could doubt their courage. Before it finally ended at sunset on October 31st, 9 men would be dead, victims of unseasonably bad weather or lapses in judgment or skill, sometimes in combination. It was a shocking toll even apart from the dozens more who dropped out of the race because of accidents, mechanical problems, or sheer exhaustion. In the end, a spectacle designed in part to promote the safety and reliability of air travel arguably did the opposite. Some editorialists all but accused Mitchell of murder. Yet there is no denying the aviators' role as pioneers in the same tradition as Charles A. Lindbergh or the first astronauts, as they hopscotched from one improvised airfield to the next. They blazed the trail for the first crude version of a transcontinental air route. Just 11 months later, the U.S. Post Office inaugurated its coast-to-coast airmail service along essentially the same path, fulfilling Prager's dream and opening the door to commercial air travel. Henry H. Hap Arnold, a Mitchell contemporary who helped organize the race and later commanded U.S. Air Forces in World War II, would one day describe the contest as the foundation of commercial aviation in the United States. The contest came at a critical time in American aviation. Though the airplane had shown its potential in war, it had yet to prove its utility in peacetime. Airmail was still in its infancy, and, except for a few short-lived experiments before World War I, commercial passenger service had not yet been realized. At least in civilian life, the airplane was little more than a curiosity, flown mostly by the gypsy flyers, later known as barnstormers, who eked out a living at fairgrounds or borrowed pastures, where they put on air shows or carried passengers on $15 joyrides. But the race between the coasts cast aviation in an entirely new light. The chain of designated airfields that spanned the continent, the communication and logistics networks that tied them together, the great distances covered by the flyers, the regular arrivals and departures, all foreshadowed the rapidly approaching age of modern air travel. Nearly 8 years before Lindbergh's electrifying flight from New York to Paris in the spirit of St. Louis, the transcontinental contest vividly demonstrated the airplane's potential as an instrument of everyday commerce. It was the opening of the latest and most thrilling chapter in the long quest to shrink the world. More than a century later, the transcontinental race is all but forgotten. I hadn't even heard of it until a few years ago, when the germ of a book idea, on airplane racing between the world wars, led me to a used copy of The Speed Seekers, an exhaustive look at the subject by Thomas G. Foxworth that was published in 1976. Most of the book focused on short races over closed courses, aerial equivalents of the Indianapolis 500, that drew huge crowds in the 1920s and 1930s. But it also included a short section on the transcontinental race. Intrigued, I walked over to the Library of Congress near my home in Washington, D.C., and searched the electronic catalog for a book on the contest. I was a little surprised that I couldn't find one. Widening my net, I consulted other aviation histories, but with one or two exceptions, most ignored the subject or mentioned it only in passing. One of the best and most comprehensive accounts that I could find was a master's thesis submitted by a young Air Force officer, Ray L. Bowers, at the University of Wisconsin in 1960. I learned more from old newspapers preserved on microfilm or in digital databases. As I read their stories on the contest, soaking up details of ice-covered wings, bulky engines, and tricky crosswind landings on dangerous fields, I became convinced that the race was worth more scrutiny than it had received. It not only signified a threshold moment in aviation history, but also was a great adventure story, one that captured the actual experience of flying open-cockpit biplanes in that era. The subject played to an abiding passion. Although I spent most of my career as a newspaper reporter, including 8 years as a foreign correspondent, I've had a lifelong interest in airplanes and flying. As a child, I was an avid builder of model planes, and my bookshelves were filled with aviation-themed works by Ernest K. Gann, Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, and other writers. The summer after graduating from college, I fulfilled my boyhood fantasy by earning a private pilot's license. I loved the challenge of flying and the unparalleled sense of freedom it offered, the exhilaration of takeoff, and the gratifying squeak of my wheels on asphalt when I made a smooth landing. I even toyed with the idea of flying as a career. That was a passing fancy. After taking my first newspaper job in Des Moines, I decided there were better uses of my time and money than buzzing cornfields in a rented Cessna. But my fascination with airplanes and the people who flew them never waned. The transcontinental race gave me a reason, my wife would call it an excuse, to start flying again. I wanted to retrace the flyers' original route as part of my research, landing at the same towns and cities, flying low and slow so I could see the country as they had. I signed up for flying lessons at a small airport outside Washington, D.C., where I slowly relearned the skills I'd lost over nearly 4 decades. After countless laps around the traffic pattern and a lot of bounced landings, my instructor signed me off as competent to fly the small 2-seater I had bought secondhand a few months earlier. My flight across the country and back in the early summer of 2019 went far more smoothly than it did for the aviators who covered the same distance a century earlier. This came as no surprise. Unlike its rickety cloth-covered forebears, my airplane had a carbon fiber fuselage, a reliable fuel-injected engine, an autopilot, and a digital instrument panel that took the guesswork out of navigating or avoiding bad weather. Air traffic controllers guided me through crowded airspace and made sure I arrived safely at my destination. And if all else failed, I could have yanked a handle beside my seat and deployed a parachute from a canister behind the cockpit. Attached to the airframe, the parachute was designed to lower the whole plane gently to Earth, like a space capsule returning from orbit. This modern innovation, an increasingly common feature of light aircraft, is a big source of comfort when flying over water or rough terrain. But judgment and skill still matter, and there were times when I was deficient in both. This led to several memorable scares, one caused by my failure to fully advance the throttle on takeoff, a cardinal sin that in other circumstances might have been my last. Every pilot has similar stories. The important thing is to learn from them. They help keep us humble. They remind us that sometimes it all comes down to luck. Wales and Goldsboro were somewhere in the vicinity of Oberg Pass when Wales decided to deviate from the compass line and turn north in the direction of the railroad. The pass was a broad saddle between two moderate peaks, Pennock Mountain to the south and Code Mountain to the north, that in clear weather would have posed no threat. But now, with snow whipping past his cockpit, Wales could barely make out the rocks and sagebrush just a few hundred feet below. The path ahead was invisible. With only his compass and a crude map to guide him, he had no way of knowing that the biplane was heading straight for Code Mountain. Wales realized his mistake too late. As the DH-4 neared the top of the 9,300-foot peak, dark trees and scrub emerged through the veil of snow. The plane was less than 200 feet above a rocky gulch. With only a second or two to react, Wales attempted to turn away, stepping on the rudder bar and shoving the stick to one side. But the plane was flying too slowly for its wings to maintain lift in a turn. With the telltale shudder of an aerodynamic stall, the DH-4 dropped its nose and entered the first revolution of a spin. Wales was out of options. He did not have the time or altitude to recover. The men could only watch as the mountain rushed to meet them. Part 1. The Air Service. Chapter 1. The Honeymoon Special. At 2 p.m. on the first day of March 1919, New Yorkers out for a Saturday stroll looked up to see biplanes performing stunts over Madison Square Garden. The aircraft had been dispatched by the U.S. Army Air Service to promote the New York Aeronautical Exposition, the first large-scale display of airplanes and aviation technology in the United States since the end of the Great War less than 4 months earlier. The exposition was due to open in just a few hours. 30 minutes later, as the Army aviators flew home to their nearby base at Hazelhurst Field on Long Island, the show's general manager ascended to the roof of the Garden's handsome Beaux-Arts structure at 25th Street and Madison Avenue, where he released 250 hydrogen-filled balloons. Each carried a ticket to the event. By the time darkness fell, an estimated 10,000 people had converged on the Garden, forming an 8-column line that stretched around the block. The opening of the doors triggered a stampede. Police, overwhelmed, called in reinforcements from a nearby station on East 22nd Street. Once they had elbowed their way inside, the visitors gaped. Weeks of feverish preparations had transformed the cavernous main hall into a fanciful tableau of an airfield in the French countryside, with a painted backdrop of forests, pastures, and airplane silhouettes. Suspended from the ceiling was a huge elongated kite balloon, or sausage, as troops called it, designed to loft artillery spotters over the battlefields of the Western Front, and a smaller barrage balloon used to deter enemy air attacks by means of dangling cables or nets. But it was the airplanes below that truly set the crowd aflutter. Crammed in at angles on the exhibition floor and in the adjacent 69th Regiment Armory, the Garden being too small to accommodate all of the manufacturers who wished to show off their wares, were more than 30 of the latest and most sophisticated models made by domestic and foreign manufacturers. Many had been developed for use in battle. Among them were several multi-engine bombers, including a towering Italian-made Caproni triplane with 3 stacked wings and a wingspan of nearly 100 feet. There was a Navy flying boat with its fabric skin removed, so that viewers could marvel at its intricate wooden frame. There was a DH-4 biplane, a powerful 2-seat bomber and reconnaissance aircraft that was based on a British design and built in Ohio by the Dayton Wright Airplane Company. And for sheer sex appeal, None could rival the nimble single-seat fighters, known as pursuit planes, that were scattered among the larger machines. They and the men who flew them had captured the public's imagination with their spiraling duels over France and Belgium, an intensely personal form of combat that evoked knights in the age of chivalry, at least to those unfamiliar with its horrors. One of the warplanes on display, a French-made Nieuport, was the same type flown by American combat aces such as Eddie Rickenbacker and Douglas Campbell, the latter being one of a number of prominent aviators on hand for opening night. Nearby was a Spad, the sturdy little fighter that also was made in France and flown to glory by that country's top-scoring ace, René Fonck. SPAD was an acronym for its manufacturer, Société pour l'Aviation et ses Dérivés. One combat plane in particular stood out, distinguished by its sleek construction and the black iron crosses on its camouflaged wings and fuselage. It was a Fokker D-7 seized from Germany as a trophy of war. For American aviation, the exposition was a kind of coming-out party. It was sponsored by the Manufacturers Aircraft Association, the fledgling U.S. Industries trade group, in close coordination with the Air Service, then part of the Army, and the forerunner of today's Air Force. Both wanted to show off their wartime achievements while building public enthusiasm for aviation in all its forms. In January 1918, President Wilson had barred aircraft manufacturers from displaying their products at exhibitions, lest they draw scrutiny from German spies. Now, the veil of secrecy had been lifted. To promote its cause, the Air Service had granted permission for officers who wished to attend the exposition to do so without taking leave, reserving a Pullman rail car for those traveling from Washington, D.C. On opening night, aviators in bob-tailed Army tunics circulated among the aircraft, gesturing to control sticks and rudder bars as they explained the finer points of loops, spins, and coordinated turns to admiring young adorables, as one reporter wrote. There were booths displaying reconnaissance cameras, aerial photographs, and a revolutionary new device called a radio telephone. Every afternoon during the exposition, an Air Service operator would hold scratchy conversations with aviators in wireless-equipped DH-4s circling overhead. Images of gunnery practice and exploding bombs flickered on a movie screen. Despite the patriotic atmosphere, visitors could not help but notice that many of the military aircraft on display had been manufactured abroad. The United States had fielded only one model, the DH-4, in combat over the Western Front. Other domestic offerings had come too late for the fighting, but not for the exposition. But an industry that had lagged its foreign competition during the war was determined to dominate the peace. A most important and valuable application not yet encouraged in this country is the carrying of passengers, wrote Glenn L. Martin, one of the country's leading aircraft designers, in the 25-cent souvenir catalog for the exposition. Important centers such as Philadelphia and New York should have a 10 or 12 passenger machine leaving a well-equipped aerodrome in both cities every half hour. This was a thinly veiled sales pitch. The Glenn L. Martin Company's huge twin-engine bomber, one of the featured attractions at the Garden, also came in a transport version, with glass windows, extra headroom, and seats for 10 passengers. During the second week of the show, the Air Service arranged for reporters to take a ride in one of the planes, which circled the 60-story Woolworth building in Manhattan, buffeted by 40-mile-an-hour winds, before returning to Hazelhurst Field. Throughout the trip, despite the wind, the absence of a chill in the air seemed remarkable, one reporter wrote. Martin's rivals also were looking ahead. The Dayton Wright Airplane Company, builder of the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?